Want to see these videos 5 days early and gain access to other exclusive perks? Then head on over to my Patreon in the description. Every contribution means the world to me. This is Asda, specifically the one in a retail park called Middlebrook, just outside my old hometown Horwich. This was the shopping area for me, the main shopping area for me growing up. And I remember it was an autumn day in 2007, I think. I've got this vivid memory of me walking through the DVD section, turning the corner, and right on the shelf against the wall was a DVD that immediately caught my eye. Thomas and Friends: The Great Discovery. The cover was so striking to me, and to this day it remains one of my favourite Thomas DVD covers of all time. I love the simplistic confidence it has. They don't have to sell this DVD with something big or over the top, like having Thomas running away from a diesel with a claw, standing near the silhouette of a new character hidden in a tunnel, or plastered in front of a giant globe. No, all they need is Thomas's happy face taking up the cover, with a couple of leaves and buildings here and there, and the kids are just like, yep, sign me up. That was me. Even though I was well into my Pixar Cars hyperfixation, as I've mentioned many times before, the cover was just that striking to me that I just had to know what Thomas was up to now. So my mum bought it for me, and as soon as we got home, I put it straight on my TV. And god damn, what an experience it was watching The Great Discovery for the first time. A new narrator? A new town we've never seen before? Who's this new silver engine? It looked like the series I was familiar with, but it felt so much bigger and much more engaging. Little did I know, this was all because big changes were on the horizon. Production on Thomas's next extended special began in 2007, around the same time they were filming the Series 11 reshoots, I want to say, as evident by the similar set designs across the special and episodes that I mentioned in the last video. Filmed with the same HD cameras brought on for the series, given the same yellow filter to try and make it seem like the whole thing was made on old film stock, emphasis on tried, and used the same brass model engine props we had become accustomed to from Series 10 onward. The story was written by a soon-to-be new head writer for the series moving forward, Sharon Miller, which, okay, her track record hasn't exactly been golden up to this point, but with the one or two gems under her belt, she certainly had potential. The rest of the team was virtually the same, Stephen Asquith as director, Simon Spencer as producer, and Robert Hartshorn as composer, with lyrical songs by Ed Welch. An additional 7 or 8 model makers were added to the original team of 11 or 12. Making a grand total of 19 model makers working on this production, under the direction of longtime model supervisor David Eves. The special went under the title of Leaders of the Track, and was only changed last minute to The Great Discovery. I say it was last minute because I feel like the intro kind of undersells the grandiosity of the film's name, with how it just uses the same font as the episode name boards from the series. Compared to Calling All Engines, where, yeah, okay, the different font choice with a whooshing sound isn't that special, but at least it was an attempt to make the beginning of the special feel special. Therefore, I feel like they had a unique opening board for Leaders of the Track, but had to stick to the default one in the 11th hour due to the sudden name change. Plus, look at it in comparison to the Japanese title card, it looks so much more striking. And aside from the new narration, this feels no different to the opening of any other Series 11 episode. Speaking of narration, a new voice was brought on for the special, and that was former James Bond actor Pierce Brosnan. Thank God they didn't go with their first choice of Gwyneth Paltrow.
Some days I feel like everyone in my world has plugged themselves into my kidneys. I'm so tired.
Emily? What the fuck are you talking about?
He was brought on to narrate both the UK and US dubs of the special, with changing terminology just as Ringo and temporarily Angelus had done in series prior.
The Fat Controller beamed from ear to ear. Sir Topham Hatt beamed from ear to ear. Next, he was pulling some heavy trucks. Next, he was pulling some heavy freight cars.
Originally, Pierce was signed on to narrate future series and specials for the show, but then the following Series 12 was narrated by the returning Angelus and Brandon. As producer Simon Spencer stated that while Brosnan's voice worked for the special, it wouldn't work for anything on a smaller scale. Therefore, Pierce took his leave after voicing the special and unused narration for Series 12, and was advertised as a special guest narrator rather than a new official narrator. Unlike the previous special, The Great Discovery was given a theatrical release in England and America throughout 2008, first premiering in July in America distributed via Kids Toons Films, and then made a special blue carpet premiere in UK View Cinemas on September the 20th, making this the second special in a row to come out in the US first. The DVD release came out the same month, followed by a theatrical release in Australia in November. It was upside down though, so nobody knew what was going on. The last piece of Black Mamba Bridge toppled down into the didgeridoos. "Oh, Struth," gasped Tommy. "That's the last time I use fucking Apple Maps." At the start of the same year, it was announced that Thomas and Friends would be transitioning into a fully CGI production, so this special was to be the final all-model production of Thomas and Friends. The grand send-off to 24 years of filming the remote-controlled engine props with working steam, moving eyes and functioning pistons, as well as all the stations, docks, bridges across running water and wooden figurines. Was it the ending that Model Series Thomas deserved? You're damn right. I really enjoyed this special as a kid, and I kinda love it now. It has very noticeable flaws, so it's not perfect, but considering the rest of the era we've sat through to get here, this is a monumental step up in quality. It's the best thing to come out of the hit series, it's the best of the 3 model-produced Thomas films, and is, on its own, a wonderful, character-driven story with a lot of heart. And I can think of no better way to close off 2024 than by tackling what is both a wonderful Thomas film and a gem from my childhood. Let's take a look at The Great Discovery. It's a busy and exciting time for the island of Sodor. Everyone is getting ready for the yearly celebration of Sodor Day, which, judging by the plans to have a brass band and funfair rides, honestly seems no different to every other day for these guys in the hit era. I'm just going to put this down as a bank holiday. Sodor is allowed one bank holiday a year. Thomas and James race each other to the wharf for a special. Why Thomas and James? Because Wharf Scale Gordon would crush the show's budget with his mass alone. Thomas wins the race, and his reward is collecting logs with Duncan, who, being Duncan, plays a trick on him, nearly getting him to cross an old bridge which collapses before he can cross it. Looking to make it to the wharf on time, Thomas takes a different track, which unknowingly takes him to a big, old, overgrown town, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. The news spreads, and upon showing this hidden town to the Fat Controller, it is identified as the once main town of Sodor when steam engines first came to the island many years ago, Great Waterton. With Great Waterton found, plans are quickly made to restore this town in time for the Sodor Day celebrations. Speaking of, now that I finally have a chance to ask people this, if the plan to restore Great Waterton was made only after they were already planning for Sodor Day, where were they going to celebrate this day originally? Knapford? Tidmouth Sheds? Some random ass beach or countryside in the middle of nowhere? Sounds like Thomas unintentionally saved Sodor from insert party and brass band here like they've seen a fucking bajillion times throughout the series. Anyway, the story follows the engines working hard to restore Great Waterton alongside the returning Jack and the Pack, with Thomas in charge of all the work. All the while, a shiny new engine from the mainland called Stanley arrives, to do Thomas's usual jobs on his branch line. Everyone can't stop talking about how much of a great guy Stanley is, and so, feeling like his discovery of Great Waterton is being overshadowed by Stanley's presence, Thomas becomes jealous. Things only seem to get worse when Thomas has an accident and his job of being in charge is instead given to Stanley. He tries to play a trick on Stanley to get his job back, making him pull too many trucks uphill, but the plan backfires as the trucks break away and wreck Great Waterton's main tower. The plans are majorly delayed and Thomas is in disgrace for what he's done. He tries to make up for his wrongdoings by working late into the night to clean things up, but ends up getting lost when he chases a runaway truck into an old mine shaft and falls into a flooded tunnel. With Thomas seemingly missing, all work is put on hold and everyone on Sodor forms a search party to find him. Thomas finally emerges from the caves when he crashes through some bushes, flies across a ravine and slides to the bottom of a hill, where he is found by the one engine who searched for him the most, the engine Thomas was once so jealous of but now wishes to be his friend, Stanley. The two help each other back to Great Waterton, and everyone on Sodor is relieved to see Thomas back in one piece. The tower is rebuilt, and Great Waterton is fully restored in time for Sodor Day. Everyone is together and happy as the narrator reads the original title of the special, Leaders of the Track, to close off this wonderful journey.
He had wanted to be the leader of the track, but we're all leaders of the track, puffed Thomas proudly, and he couldn't have been happier.
The fact that this is the longest plot summary that I've given for a Thomas film so far just goes to show how jam-packed and grandiose it is, but let's dissect this piece by piece and understand what makes The Great Discovery work so well in terms of narrative. I love the concept of Great Waterton. The idea of an old waterworks that was also once the main town of Sodor is so inspired. Its greatest strength, I think, is how simple it is. Something that I feel gets lost in translation with many Thomas films before and after The Great Discovery is needing to have these larger-than-life objects and ideas attached to them in order to make the franchise more appealing. Things like having the railway be a magical universe separate from the real world that you can only get to via gold dust, having an engine get lost at sea and washing up on a hidden island, an ancient castle, a giant pirate ship, or needing to take Thomas around the world just to convince the general audience to go and see a film about talking steam engines. That's not to say those are necessarily bad ideas for the franchise, apart from that one, but it is for that reason why Great Waterton feels so special. Like I said with the DVD cover, less is more with Thomas, and something as simple as a town that time forgot being rediscovered adds layers to a series that used to be very heavy with world building and continuity, honouring the roots of the series but not going too overboard with the concept for the sake of just because. It also helps that Great Waterton in general is just so nice to look at. Rather than just being one huge airport building with straight engine tracks just plonked to one side, it goes beyond the singular station platforms. There's a footbridge, a giant tower, 2 rail bridges, one of which turns away from the main lines and veers off into the country, streets filled with shops, flats, and a giant city hall. One entrance to the town may be flat stretches of tracks running under a rail bridge, but towards the end is a steep hill that twists and turns way more than Gordon's Hill ever did. There's things to remember about the set, which I feel like I should have saved for the production design, but who cares? I love Great Waterton's design, and it makes for an aesthetically pleasing location for the film to take place in. The story itself feels like a special event and not just a longer than normal episode of the show. I know I keep bringing Calling All Engines up, but this and The Great Discovery truly are the hit era's night and day opposites to each other. It's not just the engines saying rhymes, talking about how they're feeling, or stating the completely fucking obvious. Here, their dialogue sounds way more natural.
No holiday makers? moaned Thomas. And no aeroplanes? groaned Percy. And now you will never move out of my shed, puffed Emily.
Hello, Percy, he tooted. I thought Toby was to pick up workmen. Hello, Thomas. Stanley has given me extra jobs because he says I give very smooth rides.
The pacing feels pretty solid too, as by around the 17-minute mark, Thomas and James have had their race, Thomas had his near-death experience on Rolling River Bridge, Great Waterton has been discovered, and all the engines have begun working to restore the town for Sodor Day. The time honestly feels like it flies by. Some people say that the film tends to drag around the middle, but I don't think that's the story's fault. A lot of films tend to be slower paced and dialogue heavy in the middle for character interactions and the like, so I don't think that's why the middle is considered the weakest part of the film. As my good friend Robin of Mechanical Shed said when he, Django Fett 220 and I watched the film together, it's the part of the film that feels less like a big special event and more like the traditional hit that we're bored with. And looking at the second act of The Great Discovery with that mindset, yeah, there are some instances of it feeling like a Three Strikes Formula episode. The first time Thomas meets Stanley, he's laughing with Percy at the washdown and the two don't notice him, making him jealous. The second time he sees Stanley, he's pulling Annie and Clarabelle, doing a good job on Thomas's branch line, making him even more jealous. The third time he sees Stanley is at Tidmouth Sheds, and it's the big bad third strike, so seeing Stanley in his space is his breaking point. When Stanley is put in charge, Thomas meets Percy, who talks about why Stanley chose him for a specific job, and kind of brushes Thomas's reaction to one side. Thomas then meets up with Jack and the Pack, who are too busy to say hello to him. Then he meets the Fat Controller with Stanley at Great Waterton, and again, it's the big bad third strike as the Fat Controller decides to keep Stanley in charge. That's why I think fans tend to see the second act of The Great Discovery as the weakest part of the overall film. It reminds them of episodes like Thomas delivers such and such item to such and such location, or any other time with the dreaded three strikes formula. Thankfully though, it never feels as repetitive as those episodes. Thomas doesn't get annoyed at Stanley doing the same thing over and over. It's a gradual build-up of having his ego shattered in different circumstances. First seeing him laughing with his best friend, then working on his branch line, then seeing him have a laugh with his friends. The same applies to the three strikes of when Stanley is in charge. For that reason, I think the second act of this special isn't bad. Slower than the first and third acts, yeah, but not a game breaker by any means. There are a couple of other issues with the story that are mostly nitpicky and don't affect my love of the film that much, but like all nitpicks, I feel like they're worth mentioning. If Thomas has a new shed built for him at Great Waterton, why does he go back to Tidmouth sheds? On top of that, why is he surprised that Stanley is in his spot? I get that he wasn't listening when the Fat Controller told him he was bringing an engine from the mainland to do his work on his branch line, so maybe that was the point. But still, he has a shed at Great Waterton so he wouldn't have to travel so far to get home, so why didn't he stay there? Also, when Thomas first discovers the tracks to Great Waterton, it's right by a small yard for the narrow gauge engines, the same one that Duncan used to guide Thomas to Rolling River Bridge. How did Great Waterton go missing if the one track to get there was right by a goods yard that is still clearly in use? The show has had stories of old lines being discovered many times before. This is nothing new for the series at all, but those were usually abandoned one-off stations and mine shafts, you know, smaller confined places that could realistically be left behind and forgotten about. This was the main town of Sodor, and yet somehow, over the years, none of the standard gauge engines that came to this yard saw that one track branching off into the woods and thought, I wonder where that leads to. It's probably my lack of railway knowledge why I can't figure out how such a huge town could go missing, but yeah, that issue does circle my head whenever I come back to watch this film. Side note, there's only one track leading Thomas into the woods, but then there's two separate tracks on either side of him when he emerges at the town. Did the one track he was on split into three? If so, I hope they safely managed to signal the engines going to and from the town, or else, you know, that could happen. I'd also ask how Thomas derailed on the tracks here, because while the narrator says it's because he was going too fast, I don't know, it looks more like he hit a rock on the tracks at normal speed. As for the one or two things I just so happened to notice, this line about Max and Monty got a chuckle out of me.
And Monty and Max are dumping such heavy loads, they're getting dizzy.
That's funny. Also, I wonder if the sequence of every engine being overjoyed that Thomas is found being written entirely in rhyme was Sharon Miller just going to town for what was her first Thomas special. Given how she included more rhyming in the series before and after this special, she clearly enjoyed coming up with these for Thomas. And honestly, for this part of the film, it's not bad. It makes that whole sequence of seeing everyone relieved of Thomas being back all the more special. To me at least. I also find it pretty sweet in how what is the final all-model production of Thomas, they have him falling down the biggest, darkest and scariest mineshaft he's ever been in. A drastic step up from when he also fell down a mine in not just Series 1, but the very episode that was originally the pilot for Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. The very same pilot that got the series greenlit in the first place. Kind of like it ends, or almost ended, where it all began.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme. Every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one.
On the subject of the mineshaft, there is one more thing about the Great Discovery story that I feel makes it very, very special. It's so special, in fact, that I feel like it deserves its own section of the video. This film, if you take out Series 12 and everything in the CGI era that comes out after it, is a perfect bookend to Thomas's character. In what is a story centered around him, his discovery of Great Waterton, and the highs and lows following said discovery, we are shown what is Thomas's final atonement. Thomas has had a very up and down history in terms of how consistent his character was. In the beginning with Series 1, we followed his journey as per the books. A cheeky, egotistical prick who wanted more from life than just being a station pilot.
I'm tired of pushing coaches. I want to see the world.
But had to learn humility through trials and tribulations to gain the Fat Controller's trust. So, on the day where he was needed in an emergency, he sprung into action and proved himself as reliable and really useful, earning himself a branch line that he's had ever since. But just because he proved himself once didn't mean he was a completely changed engine yet. He still had plenty to learn. He was only as well behaved and useful as the incident with James allowed him to be, because after that, even with his branch line, he was still just as cocky, impatient and rude as ever.
If we hurried across the viaduct, it might collapse. And then you'd have no passengers at all. What would you do then? Run my train on time for one thing, retorted Thomas.
This would continue throughout the next few series with mishap after mishap after mishap, slowly allowing him to grow and mature over time. We started to see a more friendly and cheerful Thomas, a wiser engine who was prepared to help his friends without complaint.
You don't know what I suffer, moaned Henry. Rubbish, said Thomas. You're too fat, you need exercise.
I don't feel well at all.
Don't worry, said Thomas kindly. I'll help out if you're ill.
Even if he was still cheeky from time to time, that was okay because we loved that about him.
Shunted. And on my own branch too. It's a disgrace.
What ghost? asked Toby. The old warrior ghost. Every night he lights his fire, then goes hunting. Toot toot, goodbye.
You, Thomas, are small. Small, 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 teeny, weeny, weeny. And I'm a big blue engine who knows everything.
Bossy sprockets! All that steam has gone to your funnel.
Series 8 or so onwards, once Hit put their infamous Writer's Bible into effect, was where things started to fall apart. We were treated to a new Thomas, who, depending on his role in the episode's story, would flip-flop between the wise, all-knowing friend who can solve all your problems, to a lethal, energetic kid on a sugar rush, sometimes with an IQ that begins with a 0 and a decimal point.
Sometimes the thing you want is somewhere you wouldn't think to look, puffed Thomas. Thomas screeched to a halt. The chickens in the vans flapped and squawked crossly.
It was like the two sides of Thomas's character were each dialed up to 110% with no balance. If Thomas was the main character, he would usually be the hothead with a frustratingly low intelligence. If he was a supporting character, he was usually smarter than the ones who were meant to be smarter than him. There were a couple of episodes where he was written true to himself, but overall it was one way or the other with the guy. Granted, out of the rest of the main cast, his inconsistencies weren't as drastic as someone like Edward, Toby or Scarloey, but when you're the title character, it's pretty hard not to notice if the manner in which you're written fluctuates so often. Not only does The Great Discovery write Thomas as much like his classic self than we've seen of him in years, a good friend to others but still egotistical and cheeky from time to time, but this story gives us, what should have been at least, the final time Thomas lets his ego get the better of him. The very last time where Thomas really fucks up. He starts off with a small boost to his confidence when he wins the race with James, something he holds onto when talking with Duncan, teasing him whenever he can and feeling challenged when Duncan says he's too scared to cross Rolling River Bridge. Upon discovering Great Waterton and getting a huge pat on the back from the Fat Controller to a point where he's put in charge of all the work, his boosted ego is now at an all-time high, in a way that no doubt felt the same when he was promoted from station pilot to running his own branch line all those years ago. Stanley arrives, he feels threatened by the new guy in town and starts overworking himself to keep his job when it was never going to be taken away from him to begin with. So when this leads to him losing that job, he feels cheated, like he isn't important unless everyone else is looking up to him. He slips into old habits and plays a trick on Stanley that only leads himself in trouble that could have been easily avoided. Thomas, just as he has been several times in the past, is now truly in disgrace, ruining Sodor's biggest celebration yet and disappointing everyone around him in the process. He tries to make amends by working late, but it's going to take more than tidying up his own mess for him to change his ways. Again, he's only being as good as doing this job allows him to be. Who's to say he won't just go back to his old ways following this? And so, Thomas is unknowingly presented with one final challenge. what is about to be a visual metaphor for his desire to chase a life of thinking himself better than everyone else in the world. Morgan's mine. Thomas bumps the last truck too hard and it disappears into the mine. The work is done and it's just one truck, but Thomas decides to go inside and find it anyway, almost like an itch in his head that won't be scratched unless everyone knows he's done the job 100% successfully. The deeper he goes into the mine, he ends up running down a steep slope and thus begins the roller coaster of his life. The further he goes into the mine, the further away he strays from the outside world, from his friends. But being so rushed on adrenaline and only looking ahead to see what's next, he loses and forgets about the truck he's chasing. He forgets about getting out of the tunnel. He forgets about his friends. It seems like this good feeling will never end, an endless time chasing a need to feel good, to feel special, like nothing could possibly take that away.
Oh no!
If you go too far, you will eventually get stuck in this isolated life you've made for yourself. A pathway where all you can do is fall further and further into the darkness, into the cold, away from your home, away from your friends. Suddenly, all you want is to be back home, back where things made sense and weren't scary. But it's too late. You unknowingly did this to yourself. You chose a life of looking out for only yourself, and so now in your deepest, darkest despair, you feel as though nobody will want to save you.
No one will find me now, Thomas wailed. No one will want to find me.
So begins the endless cycle, a life that pushes you helplessly further and further into darkness, going faster and faster, feeling as though you can't even keep track of time anymore. It spins you around violently, suffocates you in rushing cold water. All the while, you are paralyzed and can't escape it, disconnected from the real world for what feels like forever. Until
He crashed through a thick wall of bushes.
just when you can't take any more, you'll crash once again. While the agony of the dark cave is over, it's still a terrifying tumble as you fall down to rock bottom. There is a way out of this, a way back to the life you had before, right within your grasp. But beaten and bruised from your own actions, you have no strength to bring yourself back. The chaos of the mine is over and everything is quiet. All you can do is wait, alone with your thoughts. Only in your lowest of lows will you fully realise that you were in the wrong.
I wish I hadn't made Stanley pull all those freight cars. I didn't like him doing my jobs, and now look where I am. I'm a very silly engine.
The same realisation that will allow you to reach out for help from not just any old friend or stranger, but the very person you felt was trying to make you seem lesser. They never were your worst enemy. They never have been, and they never will be. And if you're willing to accept that help, to go back to the life you once took for granted, then the two of you, maybe, can become friends.
Stanley, tooted Thomas, I'm sorry that I was horrible to you. I was wrong, and I was silly to be cross that you were in charge. I want to be your friend. Stanley smiled. Thomas, he wished. We will be friends.
Friends who help each other home. To the ones who really were worried for your well-being and are over the moon to see you come back. You mean so much more than you think you do. You mean just as much as your friends. As your family.
Thomas smiled. Now he was happy Stanley had come to Sodor. He had so many wonderful friends.
You help me and I'll help you. 3 cheers for Thomas the Tank Engine and all his friends.
You're a good friend indeed, and always will be. No engines ever felt prouder. We'll always be useful, won't we, Thomas? Of course.
Welcome to Sodor. You're a really useful engine, Thomas.
It feels good to be friends. 3 cheers for Thomas, the #1 engine. Hip hip hooray!
How could I ever have wanted to be more important than any of them? He puffed to himself.
For years, I have had the most middling thoughts on Stanley. He was the nice guy whose mere presence sets off Thomas's ego. That's about it. And because they never did anything else with him in the show following this film, for the longest time, I never saw anything else about his character, and going into making this video, I wondered if I would have much to say about him at all. I am delighted to say that upon my recent rewatch, I have made a great discovery myself. I have been able to pinpoint Stanley's personality unique to him. He is blissfully naive and seeks the good in everyone, even if they're clearly behaving badly. For what are his first days working on Sodor, he treats everybody with kindness and respect, blissfully unaware of Thomas's jealousy towards him. That moment with him going back to Tidmouth Sheds, he is standing where everyone can see him and is visibly annoyed. His friends pay no mind to it because they know Thomas. They know he's hot-headed and temperamental because they've worked and hung around him for years. But not Stanley. He sees that upset look on Thomas's face and disregards him, not out of spite or animosity. He just thinks Thomas was being genuine when he said he had to go back to his shed. When the accident with the tower happens, all the other engines know Thomas played the trick he did because he was petty and are immediately frustrated with him. Thomas is 100% in the wrong here, and Stanley had every right to be just as cross with Thomas for making a fool of him. But he isn't. He sees Thomas all alone and feeling sorry for himself for what he did, and while any other engine would gloss over this, because it's nothing new for Thomas when he fucks up, Stanley instead feels sorry for him. The next day, Thomas has gone missing, and after everyone has searched high and low in their unsuccessful attempt to find him, Stanley has a quiet moment by himself, remembering all the times he saw Thomas upset. And from this, we get what I think is one of the most fascinating perspectives on Thomas's character and why he behaves the way he does.
Thomas isn't a bad engine. He's a sad engine.
Think about that for a second. Throughout the years we've known Thomas, we have always assumed him to be a cheeky prick, a guy who finds genuine enjoyment from making everyone else look smaller while he stands proud as the most important. While they absolutely play with that side of his character to make you believe that about him, what if he wasn't? What if all those times we saw Thomas lashing out and causing problems wasn't out of spite, but from feeling genuinely intimidated, a feeling of insecurity that plagued the beginning of his life as a station pilot, one that even after he got his own branch line, never truly went away. None of the engines on Sodor could ever spot that, because they've settled into thinking he's just selfish. Only an engine like Stanley, who was completely oblivious to Thomas's bad behaviour towards him, is optimistic and naive enough to question this about Thomas.
I wonder if he has run away because he thinks no one likes him anymore.
This is Stanley's greatest strength and his greatest weakness. While it lets him see the good in everybody, Thomas was still in the wrong for what he did, and had it been up to Stanley, he may not have learned his lesson like he did the hard way. This same naivety also makes Stanley unaware of his own limits. Thomas shunted a train of trucks that was clearly too heavy to pull up the steep hill, but he tried anyway because he doesn't see what Thomas is trying to do and thinks he can do it. So while the accident was Thomas's fault, absolutely, if you zoom out a bit, Stanley is kind of to blame. This lack of awareness of his own strength comes back to bite him much later when he pulls Thomas back onto the rails. He's stuck in the dirt, and his firebox being full of water from the mine makes him even heavier, but Stanley still persists to get him out. While he pulls Thomas to safety, it bursts his safety valve, getting them both stuck on the line.
Stanley was a very strong engine, but pulling Thomas had been too much.
it actually makes Stanley an interesting mirror reflection of Thomas. Both are willing to work themselves too hard for a job, but for different reasons. For Thomas, it's his ego, whereas Stanley is just being naive of his limits in his desire to help out. Had they done something more with Stanley in the show, I would have loved to see them develop this side of him. Regardless, I am glad that I now see what makes him such a special and unique character in this film. I like that Duncan got to play a part in the first act, the instigator that unintentionally leads Thomas to eventually discovering Great Waterton, while just being his usual cheeky self. I do feel like them setting him up in the first act only to ditch him from then onward does feel like a bit of a waste, but then the narrow gauge cast don't do anything major in this film because they're far away from the town. Trying to write them in would feel a bit forced, I think. I'm just glad my favourite narrow gauge character got some significant role in the film. The rest of the characters are mostly sidelined, but that was intentional as to keep the focus of the story on Thomas and Stanley. I'm happy to say that these guys mostly feel like their old selves that we love to see in the past. A part of me can't help but wonder, however, if it's because they're given so little time in the spotlight that they don't have any moments to revert to their hit-era personas. Like, we don't see Skarloey being a whiny, irresponsible child because his one speaking role is shared with the narrow gauge engines. Or we don't see Toby having pantophobia because he only has one line in the whole film.
Why would Thomas do such a thing? Asked Toby.
I have to say though, after watching these guys be so inconsistently portrayed for 4 series in a row beforehand, I'm just relieved to see these guys not be so obnoxiously out of character. I'm also very glad that I decided to review Jack in the Pack as part of the review series, because of course Sodor's construction company would be involved in the rebuilding of a new town, and so their return was inevitable. That scene where the Fat Controller calls Miss Jenny to let her know the plan and you hear that familiar theme of the pack in the background, oh, that put a smile on my face, it really did. I love that these guys came back, and I really appreciate how cleverly they were filmed to seem like they were at Great Waterton without having to build a whole new set in their scale, which would have been just impossible. Every time we see them working, it's implied to be behind this bridge that branches off, switching between the 1 gauge and jack scale props of Thomas and Percy whenever they need to go to that part of the town. They are just as much a part of the film's final scene as everyone else, and it makes it feel all the more wholesome as a result. The production team really went above and beyond to make these guys feel included. Speaking of which... this is the best production design in the entire hit model series, hands down. With such a huge team working on this, not only do we get so many new props, but also brand new locations. To talk about those besides Great Waterton, Rolling River Bridge may not seem that high compared to, say, the suspension bridge from Calling All Engines, or even the viaduct if we were compared to all bridges in the series, but the sheer size of such an old bridge barely holding itself together only to collapse and fall makes that whole scene quite intense to watch. Morgan's mind may seem a little over the top, and just like Rolling River Bridge, it may feel less like a new location for the series, but more for the thrills. The action!
Wow.
The suspense
Come out!
of toy sales. But who cares? It wants to be big, dark and scary, and it is big, dark and scary. The collapsing of Great Waterton's main tower, also an excellent model stunt. Not as big as the tower collapse in the Jack in the Pack series, of course, but still allows the model crew to flex their skills and dedication for their craft. The Great Discovery feels like a celebration of the hit model era, as it utilises everything unique to each individual series beforehand to play a role in this film's production. Not only do we have the same HD cameras brought on for Series 11, but they're also using a lot more of those high-angle 3/4 shots of the characters they experimented with in Thomas and the Runaway Car. And yeah, they also have the same piss filter problems, but that's what colour correction is for. Thanks... hold on, who made this again? It was the same version that Thomas Fan 261 used in his review, so let me just... there we go. Thank you, Random Melon. I couldn't find your channel anywhere, but if you are watching, thanks anyway. We have Thomas and James racing to the wharf, the set first introduced in Series 10 along with Wharf Scale James. bringing in new characters, which, while not unique to Series 9, this was when Hit started to introduce characters not conceptualized by the classic era, so to me, I'd say that counts. Even Series 8 gets some representation, with the infamous fisheye lens coming back one more time for the POV and tracking shots of Thomas in Morgan's mine. The slightly warped camera quality during those shots make the slope tracks feel like the roller coaster ride it's trying to be, while also making the running down the flooded tunnel feel super uneasy, like everything about this mine is so different and disconnected from the outside world, making you feel scared. See? That's how you use the fisheye lens. You've just got to be at the tail end of the era to get it to work properly. But I digress. They brought back so many props for this film. Not just characters like Arthur, Dennis, Diesel 10, Bill and Ben, but little additions like the fire engine from Series 5, Tom Tipper's post van from Series 4, albeit in a different colour, and even... Hey guys, look! It's Butch! You know, from Horrid Lorry, that one rescue vehicle that brought in one of the lorries. Did you guys know that back in the day I had a shit ton of people funding my comments saying that I forgot to mention Butch as a character despite the fact that he never had a face nor was ever addressed by the narrator following Horrid Lorry, even after he gained a face was only ever used as set dressing, yet was somehow treated as a separate character that got his own appearance in the CGI series in Series 15 so many years later? Yeah, me neither. While not every character or every prop was brought back, the fact that we did get to see these familiar faces and classic pieces come back just adds that little bit extra to make it feel like a celebration of both eras of Model Thomas. It's sweet. Pierce Brosnan's narration is such a welcome change from Michael Angelis and Michael Brandon. As much as I can cherry pick a couple of their best moments from Series 7 to 11, like I have before, when the writing kept getting lazier and lazier as the series continued, you could tell they were starting to get tired from having to read the same kind of repetitive stories year after year, not to mention the crap ton of learning segments in between each one. Bringing on Pierce for The Great Discovery showed not only the benefits of bringing in a fresh new voice for the narrator, but also proved that if you're gonna pump out a new series of Thomas every year, having one voice actor for both UK and US dubs saves time. Time that the narrator can use to get the voice inflections and enthusiasm just right.
I won! Tooted Thomas. Hooray! Bad luck, James. James's cheeks were as red as his paintwork. I'll win on the way back to Tidmouth.
Pierce's narration is so gentle, and this was intentional, as he stated in an interview that he reads these stories as if he was reading them to his own children.
I basically tell the story, as if I was talking to my own son or daughter, who's 4 or 5. And you try to have as much of an intimate relationship with your voice and the person or the people, the children, the parents who are listening to you.
He isn't as loud as Angelus or Brandon, but he doesn't sound like he's toning it down for kids either. A standout moment for me comes from the bridge scene where, after the first section comes loose, he starts talking very quietly as Thomas reverses to safety, making you think things have calmed down, only for him to raise the intensity at the snap of a finger as the section finally breaks away.
He puffed slowly and carefully. Then there was another mighty crack!
I love it. He also stated that he not only read the books to his children, but also expressed an admiration for Ringo when he narrated the series back in the day. He has a deep respect for the franchise, and nowhere else can you tell that than in the voices he does for the characters.
What's restoration? He wished quietly. Restoration, groaned Gordon loudly. That is when you make something very old look new again.
My personal favourite is of course the Scottish accent he gave Duncan.
Mr. Percival says that because you mainline engines don't know the tracks in the hills, Duncan teased.
Pierce showed a lot of promise as a narrator, and it makes me wish we got to hear more of it throughout the series. So this is usually where I stop in terms of talking about the dubs of Thomas and Friends, but during the making of this video I was looking for the visual of the Japanese opening for The Great Discovery, and I stumbled upon the Japanese dub of The Great Discovery. Save Thomas, Mystery Mountain. A name that doesn't really make sense in terms of the story, given that the only mountain is the one that Morgan's mine is based in, but nonetheless I decided to watch the Japanese dub out of curiosity, and I quite enjoyed it. It has the same uniqueness to it with the characters having their own voice actors, such as John Kabira as the narrator,
緑の野原や黄色い砂のビーチが広がり、
Masashi Abira as James,
さっき新しい機関車に会ってきたよ。スタンリーって言うんだ。すごく優しくて、もうみんなと仲良しだよ。
and of course Kumiko Higa as Thomas.
みんなにこのことをすぐ教えなきゃ。
Getting to watch this film with individual voices for the cast makes for such a different vibe, and I love the little details they include. Stanley saying hello at Brendam as the narrator introduces him, that wasn't there before.
みんな、こんにちは。
彼はトーマスよりもピカピカで大きくて力強かった。
Thomas yelling as he topples off the track while the narrator is still speaking.
スピードを出しすぎたままカーブを曲がってしまったのだ。トーマスは線路から転がり落ちてしまった。
And how Thomas's voice has more of a consistent reverb when he's stuck in the mine, something that wasn't there in the English dub.
Oh, frizzling fireboxes! This tunnel is flooded! He gasped.
なんてことだ。このトンネルは水浸しだよ。
It was a fun watching experience, and I highly recommend you watch this special with this dub if you can find the archive for it anywhere. Robert Hartshorne's score for The Great Discovery is pretty good. A lot of his familiar tunes from the past are used here, which does mean the return of the brass horns, but thankfully it's never to the point of feeling like it takes over the special. The harp and piano he uses when Thomas first discovers Great Waterton is top notch. The suspense that builds when Stanley tries to pull the train of trucks up the hill is great. Stanley's theme in general is one of his best character themes, and I just love the eerie sense of dread and helplessness in the music for the flooded tunnel. I still think his work for the rescored versions of Series 7 are his best work for the model series, but this film is a close second. As is now tradition with Thomas films, we have some song segments courtesy of Ed Welch, and like with his songs in Calling All Engines, I do like them, even if I don't go out of my way to listen to them outside of the film, if that makes sense. Thomas and James Are Racing is a decent starting song, even if it gets a bit repetitive. There's a Job for Everyone is pretty much a less goofy but more catchy version of Busy from Calling All Engines. Where Oh Where Is Thomas is a great listen, and the engine roll call is still ear-grating but thankfully skippable. I am also incredibly grateful that these songs do not feel like pace breakers, as there is always a lengthy amount of story beats that happen in between them, and because they very wisely kept the learning segments of The Great Discovery as a DVD option, not tethered to the film itself. Oh my god, thank you! Then we come to the closing song that always comes to mind whenever The Great Discovery is brought up. Thomas, You're the Leader, a rap pop rock version of the engine roll call, written by Pete Woodruff and Charlie Grant, and performed by Chris Maiden. This is a song that is incredibly cheesy, like enough to give your arteries lactose intolerance. But I love it. It's the only time I can call a song with the engine roll call in it good. I love the line where Chris basically hypes up Duncan.
Rheneas, and then Peter, Sam, Scarloey, Duncan, he's my man.
And just something about those guitar riffs in the chorus makes me feel nostalgic in a happy, sad sort of way. Like this is the end of an era for Thomas, but you still smile that it happened. Lovely, lovely stuff. The Great Discovery is the embodiment of what makes Thomas and Friends so special. Everything from its story and setting, characters, the look, the sound, everything about it just feels so grand without trying to be, which is what the moral of the film is in the first place. You don't have to try so hard to be special because you are more important than you realise. It's kind of symbolic if you think about it that way. The set for Great Waterton doesn't try to be the brightest and bombastic set design of the series. The story itself isn't about Thomas going on his craziest adventure yet, but is instead a character-driven story about acceptance and realising your own self-worth. Neither is the narrator shouting aloud for all to hear. This is a film that thrives on simplistic beauty, the spirit of what Thomas has been since day one. The idea that this takes place in the real world, and the only thing different is that the trains have faces and can talk, both in the show and the books it's based on. It has its problems that come as standard to the era it was produced during, but those are so few and far in between that it rarely matters. If anything, this special feels like the team finally perfecting the formula for the writer's Bible they've been working with for years. Taking what didn't work in Series 8 to 11 and especially Calling All Engines by removing the learning segments, introducing a new location for the series that doesn't feel at all like a gimmick of the week, featuring as many characters and cameos as possible without needlessly streamlining them to a limited cast, and using an opportunity to tell a story that feels true to the Little Blue Tank engine we've known for years. It isn't perfect, but come on, an 8 out of 10 is still fucking amazing. It's a classic of my childhood, an important landmark for the franchise's history, and is a grand farewell to the model era of Thomas. Except it wasn't.
He was pushing trucks of bunting onto the main track.
The steam has made my camera wet.